The wind was a thief. It stole the heat from Alara's bones, the moisture from her eyes, and the last vestiges of courage from her heart. It screamed across the plains, a malevolent chorus that found every crack in the dilapidated ranch house, filling the single room with dust and the scent of decay. This place, Blackwood Creek, was her inheritance. A cruel joke left behind by a husband she had barely known and mourned even less. The deed, signed over to her in lieu of debts she never knew he'd accrued, felt like a sentence, not a gift. The paper had promised 100 acres and a dwelling. It had not mentioned the skeletal remains of barns clawed down by time, the skeletal cattle caught in fences, or the well that coughed up little more than brackish mud. Despair was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making each breath a conscious effort. She stood on the warped porch, her thin shawl clutched tight, and surveyed the bruised twilight landscape. The land was a study in browns and grays, a vast, empty canvas that promised only hardship. It was here, in this oppressive silence broken only by the wind's howl, that she saw him for the first time. A silhouette against the dying light, tall and broad, standing motionless by the skeletal line of a fence a quarter-mile distant. He was as still as the dead trees, a part of the unforgiving landscape. Fear, sharp and cold, pierced through the dull ache of her grief. The lawyer in the dusty town miles away had failed to mention this. He had spoken of the ranch as abandoned, cursed, a place no one wanted. He had not said it was occupied. The figure did not move, did not wave, did not acknowledge her presence. He simply stood, watching. The isolation she had dreaded moments before now felt like a lost luxury. She was not alone, and as the last sliver of sun bled out below the horizon, plunging the world into an inky, starless dark, Alara knew with a certainty that chilled her more than the wind that her true trial had only just begun. The house was no fortress. Its door was a flimsy suggestion, its windows dark, vacant eyes. She was a trespasser in her own inheritance, and the land itself, along with its silent guardian, was watching. The next morning, the man was gone from the fence line, but his presence lingered, a disquieting hum beneath the ceaseless wind. Alara spent the day in a frantic, useless sort of activity, trying to impose order on absolute decay. She swept floors that were more dirt than wood, tried to patch a broken window pane with a piece of burlap sack, and inspected the pitifully small pile of provisions she had brought with her. It would not last a week. By afternoon, her thirst was a torment. After another failed attempt at the well, she slumped onto the porch steps, head in her hands, the dry sobs catching in her throat. When she finally looked up, a galvanized steel bucket sat on the bottom step, a few feet from her worn boots. It hadn't been there before. Water, clean and clear, sloshed near the brim, catching the pale afternoon light. Not a drop was spilled. She scanned the horizon, her heart hammering against her ribs. Nothing. The plains were empty, the barns silent. He had come and gone as quietly as a shadow, leaving this offering. It was not an act of welcome, she thought, felt more like a statement, a demonstration of capability. I can draw water where you cannot. I belong here, you do not. She hesitated, her mind a whirlwind of suspicion and desperate need. Was it poisoned? A trick? But the thirst was a fire in her throat, and the water was a promise of life. She dipped her cupped hands into the bucket, the cold shocking her skin, and drank. It was the purest, sweetest water she had ever tasted, cold as a mountain spring. The act felt like a surrender, an admission of her own inadequacy. That evening, as she huddled by a small, sputtering fire in the stone hearth, she saw him again. He was walking the perimeter of the property, his stride long and unhurried. He carried something that looked like a rifle held loosely in one hand. He was not a ghost. He was flesh and blood, a man who knew this desolate land and moved through it as if it were his own private kingdom. She was the intruder, the ghost haunting his domain. A week bled into the next, each day a mirror of the last. A rhythm, stark and unsettling, established itself. Alara would wake to the oppressive quiet, her body aching with a weariness that sleep could not touch. She would busy herself with the small, futile tasks of survival, her world shrinking to the 4 crumbling walls of the cabin and the small patch of blighted earth around it. And always there were the signs of him. One morning, 2 snared rabbits, cleaned and ready for the pot, lay on the chopping block outside. Another day, a section of the sagging porch roof, which had threatened to collapse with every gust of wind, was reinforced with new timber, crudely but effectively braced. He never showed himself in the act. These were gifts left in the twilight hours, tasks completed in the dead of night. She would catch glimpses of him in the distance, mending a fence, clearing fallen branches from the dry creek bed, or simply standing on a high ridge, a sentinel surveying his territory. She learned the shape of him, the steady, patient way he moved. His name, she had learned in town, was Silas. The name was always spoken with a downward glance, a slight shake of the head. A man shadowed by a tragedy no one would fully articulate, something about a fire and a family lost long ago. They said he had won the ranch from the previous owner in a game of cards for a single cent, a story that only added to his mythic, fearsome reputation. He was a phantom, a local legend people used to frighten their children. But the man she watched was no monster. He was a creature of profound and solemn purpose. He was the land's keeper. Her fear, a constant, sharp-edged thing, began to soften, its edges worn smooth by a growing, grudging respect. He was not trying to scare her away. He was, in his own silent, incomprehensible way, keeping her alive. The loneliness was still a cavern inside her, but it was no longer empty. It was now occupied by his silent, watchful presence. The rumble came from the east, a low growl of engines that did not belong in the quiet desolation of Blackwood Creek. Alara was outside, attempting to coax a few withered vegetables from a patch of hard-packed soil, when she saw the dust cloud. A black automobile, a rare and jarring sight, bounced and rattled along the barely there track leading to the ranch house. 3 men emerged, their city clothes looking absurdly out of place against the stark landscape. The leader, a man with a soft body and hard eyes named Abernathy, held a sheaf of papers. He had been a business associate of her late husband. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice slick with false sympathy that didn't reach his eyes. "A tragedy, your husband's passing. A tragedy for his investors as well." He gestured dismissively at the crumbling house. "This is all that's left. We're here to relieve you of the burden." They were here to pick the bones. They spoke of water rights, of surveying lines, of legal claims she could not comprehend. Their words were a swarm of wasps, meant to confuse and intimidate. One of the other men, younger and bolder, stepped onto the porch, testing the wood with his polished shoe. "Not much, is it? Barely worth the gas to get out here. We'll give you $100 for your signature." More than it's worth, Alara's fear returned. But this time it was different. It was laced with a hot, sharp anger. This was hers. This broken, haunted place was the only thing in the world that belonged to her. She straightened her back, clutching the handle of her garden hoe. "This ranch is not for sale," she said, her voice trembling but firm. Abernathy chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Don't be foolish, woman. You can't survive out here. Be sensible." It was then that Silas appeared. He did not emerge from the house or the barn. He simply materialized at the edge of the clearing, as if the air itself had coalesced to form him. He stood with the rifle held loosely at his side, its barrel pointed at the ground. He said nothing. He did not need to. His presence was a physical force, shifting the very atmosphere of the encounter. The men from the city froze. They had heard the stories. They were looking at the legend. Abernathy's smug expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine fear. He glanced from Silas's stony face to Alara's defiant one. "This isn't over," he hissed. But his retreat was already beginning. The men scrambled back into their automobile, a clumsy, hurried exit that kicked up a cloud of indignant dust. They were gone. Silas remained for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the road where they had disappeared. Then, without a word or a glance in her direction, He turned and walked away, melting back into the landscape that had produced him. The sky turned the color of a bruise that evening. The wind, which had been a constant companion, fell into an unnerving silence. A strange, greenish light bled over the horizon, and the air grew thick and heavy, charged with an energy that made the hairs on Alara's arms stand on end. The storm broke with a sudden, violent fury. Rain came not in drops but in solid, wind-driven sheets that hammered against the cabin. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a deafening explosion that shook the very foundations of the house. Alara huddled by the hearth, the small fire doing little to combat the profound, invasive cold. A particularly violent gust of wind was followed by the sharp, splintering crash of glass. The burlap sack she had used to patch the window was torn away, and the storm invaded the room, a screaming vortex of wind and water that extinguished her lamp and sent embers scattering from the fireplace. Panic seized her. In the flickering, chaotic light of the dying fire, the door was thrown open. Silas stood there, silhouetted against the churning gray chaos, rain plastering his dark hair to his skull. He held a hammer in one hand and a few rough planks of wood in the other. He moved past her without a word, his focus entirely on the broken window. He worked with a swift, brutal efficiency, his movements economical and sure. He hammered the boards over the gaping hole, the rhythmic thud of the hammer a steady counterpoint to the storm's chaotic symphony. He blocked the wind and the rain, sealing the breach. When he was finished, the room was plunged into near-total darkness, the only light coming from the faint, pulsing glow of the embers in the hearth. The roar of the storm was muffled, a beast held at bay. He turned, and in the dim light, she could see the water dripping from his face and clothes, pooling on the floor around him. He had faced the tempest to protect her shelter. The fear she had once felt for him seemed a distant, foolish memory. It was replaced by something else, something warm and fragile. She gestured to the hearth. "Stay," she said, her voice barely a whisper above the howl of the wind. He hesitated, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. She added more wood to the fire, coaxing it back to life, and shared what she had. A thin stew of rabbit and withered roots. They ate in silence, the space between them filled only by the crackle of the flames and the muted roar of the storm outside. It was a communion, an unspoken acknowledgement of a bond forged in hardship and necessity. The world after the storm was scrubbed clean, the air sharp and cold, the sky a brilliant, aching blue. The deluge had reshaped the land, carving new channels in the dry earth and turning the creek bed into a shallow, flowing stream. 2 days later, Silas appeared at her door in the bright light of morning. It was the first time he had approached her so directly in the daylight. He did not speak, but gestured with his head toward the high ridges to the west. It was an invitation, command. She did not question it. She pulled on her sturdiest boots, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and followed him. He led her away from the familiar, broken-down heart of the ranch, up into the rocky, untamed country that bordered the property. The climb was arduous, her city-softened muscles protesting, but he set a slow, patient pace, waiting for her when she faltered. He moved with an innate knowledge of the terrain, his feet finding paths where she saw only impassable scree. He led her to a narrow, almost invisible fissure in a sheer rock face, a place choked with overgrown thorns and shadowed by a looming overhang. It looked like nothing more than a shallow cave, a den for some wild animal. She could feel a cool draft emanating from the opening. He pushed aside a thick curtain of ancient, thorny vines, revealing a dark, narrow passage. He lit a lantern he had carried with him, its golden light pushing back the oppressive blackness, and looked at her. It was a silent question. "Do you trust me?" She met his gaze, and for the first time, she saw something beyond the stoic mask, a flicker of uncertainty, of hope. She nodded. She followed him into the earth. The passage was tight and damp, the air growing cooler with every step. After 100 feet, it opened into a vast, breathtaking cavern. The lantern light reflected off walls that glittered with mineral deposits, and the ceiling soared into a darkness the light could not touch. But it was the sound that stopped her breath. A gentle, constant music. The sound of moving water. In the center of the cavern, a pool of water, impossibly clear, bubbled up from a deep, hidden spring. It was not a trickle. It was a steady, generous flow that disappeared into another channel at the far end of the cave. An underground river, emerging here in this secret place before vanishing back into the rock. Here, sheltered from the sun and wind, was a limitless source of pure, life-giving water. In this parched, thirsty land, it was a treasure beyond measure. It was not gold or silver. It was life itself. It was the secret heart of Blackwood Creek, the reason for its curse and its blessing. It was worth millions, not in dollars, but in the currency of survival, of future, of hope. Alara stared at the hidden spring, her mind struggling to grasp the magnitude of the discovery. All her suffering, the thirst, the dust, the despair. It had all happened just a few hundred yards from this secret oasis. She turned to Silas, her eyes wide with 1,000 questions. He was watching her, not the water, his expression unreadable in the flickering lantern light. For the first time, he spoke more than a single word at once. His voice a low rumble that seemed to be pulled from the very rock around them. The old man, Hewitt, he found it. Silas began, his gaze finally shifting to the bubbling pool. He was my friend. This was his place. He paused, the silence stretching as he gathered the words. He lost it all. Debts. To a man in the city, Alara's breath caught. Her husband. Hewitt made me promise. Protect the spring. Don't let them poison it. Don't let them sell it off piece by piece. Silas's story unfolded, sparse and unadorned. He had been here when Hewitt died, had stayed on as a ghost, a guardian. The tale of him winning the ranch for a cent was a lie the town had invented. A lie he had allowed to grow because it kept people away. The fear he inspired was a shield, protecting the most valuable secret in the entire territory. His stoicism was not a lack of feeling, but a surfeit of it. A quiet, unyielding monument to grief and loyalty. He had been living this solitary life for years, honoring a deathbed promise. He had watched her arrive, another extension of the man who had ruined his friend, and had not known what to do. He had seen her struggle, her resilience, her refusal to be broken by the hardship that should have sent her fleeing back to civilization. He had tested her, and she had not failed. "The storm," he said, gesturing back toward the entrance. It washed away the brush that covered the opening, made it easier to find. He looked at her, and the meaning was clear. The land itself had decided. It had revealed its secret to her. She was no longer just the inheritor of a worthless deed. She was now the keeper of the spring, a title passed not through law or money, but through endurance and a silent understanding. The weight of this responsibility settled on her, but it was not a crushing weight like her grief had been. It was a grounding force, a purpose. She was part of this place now, bound to it by its hidden lifeblood. The black automobile returned less than a week later. This time it did not stop at the house. It churned past, its engine a snarling affront to the quiet, and headed directly for the high country. Abernathy had not been idle. He must have had men scouting, seen the new flow of water in the creek after the storm, and put the pieces together. This was no longer a negotiation. It was an invasion. Alara saw them from the porch, her heart seizing not with fear, but with a cold, clear fury. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth. A pitiful weapon, but it felt solid and real in her hand, and ran, not away from the threat, but toward it, toward the hidden spring. She found Silas already there, standing near the concealed entrance to the cavern. He held his rifle, but he was not aiming it. He was simply waiting, a figure of granite patience. He gave her a sharp, quick look as she arrived, breathless, poker in hand. There was no surprise in his eyes, only a quiet acknowledgement. They stood together as Abernathy and his 2 men approached on foot, their city shoes slipping on the loose rock. "There you are," Abernathy called out, his voice echoing unnaturally in the canyon. He was holding a pistol, its metal glinting in the sun. We know what you're hiding. This land and everything under it is collateral on an unpaid debt. It belongs to us. This land belongs to itself, Alara said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. She had shed her old self somewhere in the dust and the wind of this place. The terrified widow was gone. In her place stood the keeper of the spring. Abernathy laughed. The woman's found her tongue. It won't do you any good, he raised the pistol. Step aside. Both of you. Silas didn't move. He didn't raise his rifle. He simply said, no. The word was flat, absolute. It was not a refusal. It was a law of nature. The younger man beside Abernathy, emboldened by his employer's weapon, lunged forward, trying to push past Silas to get to the cave entrance. It was a fatal miscalculation. Silas moved with a speed that was shocking in a man so large. It was not a fight. It was a correction. He sidestepped the man's rush, using his momentum against him. A hard shove, a foot placed with surgical precision, and the man tumbled backward. His scream cut short as he fell hard against the unforgiving rock face and slid to the ground, stunned and groaning. The balance of power had shifted in a single brutal second. The confrontation shattered the canyon's peace. Abernathy, his face pale with shock and rage, fired his pistol. The shot was wild, born of panic, the bullet ricocheting off the rock wall high above their heads with a high-pitched whine. The sound was an abomination in this sacred place. It was the moment Alara acted. While Abernathy was momentarily distracted by his own weapon's recoil, she screamed and charged, not at him, but at a tall, unstable pillar of loose rock and shale just to his left. She slammed the iron poker into its base with all her strength. Once, twice, the structure groaned. Silas, understanding her intent instantly, fired his rifle. Not at Abernathy, but at the rock pillar just above where she had struck. The impact of the bullet was the final persuasion. With a grinding roar, the pillar collapsed, unleashing a localized landslide of rock and scree. It wasn't large enough to be lethal, but it was a terrifying display of force. Abernathy and his remaining man cried out, scrambling backward to avoid being buried. They stumbled and fell, pelted by dust and small stones. The path to the cave was completely blocked by a new wall of rubble. The secret was safe again. Abernathy, his fine suit covered in dust, his face a mask of terror and humiliation, stared at the rockfall, then at the two figures standing before it. He saw not a helpless widow and a strange hermit, but two people forged from the very rock and hardship of this land, people he could not bully, threaten, or buy. He and his conscious henchmen dragged the other man back toward their car, a graceless, pathetic retreat. They did not look back. They knew they were defeated. They would not return. The dust began to settle, the silence flowing back into the canyon, broken only by the sound of their own breathing and the distant, triumphant murmur of the hidden water. Alara's hands were shaking, the adrenaline singing through her veins. She looked at Silas, who was calmly reloading his rifle. He met her gaze, and for the first time, a small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was a look of profound, shared victory. They had not just protected a spring. They had defended their home. The quiet that followed was different from the silence that had first greeted her. It was no longer empty or oppressive. It was a peaceful, living thing, filled with the promise of the water that flowed beneath their feet. Alara and Silas stood before the rubble that now guarded the cavern entrance. The land had protected itself with their help. She looked from the sealed cave to the man beside her. His presence was no longer a source of fear or mystery, but one of comfort, of solidity. He was as much a part of this place as the rock and the sky, and now, she realized, so was she. The ranch was no longer a curse. It was a sanctuary. Its whispered legends and spooky reputation were a form of armor, its desolation a disguise for its life-giving heart. She thought of the word millions. The men from the city saw it as money, as a resource to be exploited and sold. But here, standing under the vast, clean sky, Alara understood its true meaning. The value was not in selling the water. It was in having it. It was the promise of a green garden in the middle of the dust. It was the assurance of life, of endurance. It was the freedom from thirst, from want, from the grasping hands of men like Abernathy. This was her fortune. A life carved from the wilderness, a partnership forged in silence and shared struggle, and a future that was, for the first time, truly her own. She was not the woman who had arrived here, brittle with grief and fear. That woman had been scoured away by the wind, baked out by the sun. What was left was stronger, more resilient, rooted in the very earth she stood upon. Silas turned his gaze from the canyon wall to the sprawling plains below, where the ranch house stood small but defiant. He looked toward the setting sun, and she followed his gaze. The harsh landscape was softened by the golden light, its browns and grays transformed into shades of copper and rose. It was beautiful. It was home. He gave a slight nod, as if acknowledging the end of a long and difficult chapter. She nodded back, a silent accord passing between them. They were the keepers of Blackwood Creek, guardians of its secret heart. Together they would make the desert bloom.